Well, yeah, thanks everybody. I did not expect to be up here. I got on an airplane just thinking I was going to be an attendee for the week and doing the same thing that you're doing, and other plans happened. So I'm grateful to be here. I was a business owner for many years prior to selling my business and coming to Ramsey full time, and so honestly, coming to Summit, coming to Master Series, doing anything with EntreLeadership is one of the most kind of fulfilling and life-giving things for me because I get to be around my people. So thanks all of you for being so welcoming. I'm excited to be here. And let's talk about uncomfortable conversations. Somebody made the joke to me yesterday that I am now officially the Grim Reaper of EntreLeadership events because I talk about all the really hard stuff, but it's exciting to be here. So a number of years ago, I was sitting on the couch with my wife one night, and her phone lit up. Not an unusual thing. Our house is just like yours. We get text messages, in the evening. But there was something a little bit different about it this time, because when she picked up her phone and looked at the text message, you could just kind of like feel the air in the room change. And it got real awkward for a second. And my wife kind of looked at me, looked at her phone, looked at me again, and just like handed me her phone. And the text message that she received was from Anne, the wife of a team member that I had fired that morning. Let that sink in for just a second. So my wife and I were we're frozen. We're freaked out, we're frozen. We're both looking at our phones, sitting right next to each other. And we're waiting for that, next text message to come in. And there's this ridiculous, menacing little animation that apparently a handful of engineers and designers at Apple thought would be a great idea. And I will say, in these particular circumstances, that feature is a really anxiety-inducing animation. I'll just put that out there. But my wife and I are staring at her phone, just waiting for that next text message to come through. And when Anne actually did send that second text message, here's what it said. Our husbands just finished walking a difficult road together. The conclusion was hard, but the process was fair, dignified, and loving. I hope we can stay friends. Yeah. So even as I read that now, I get a little choked up. That it kind of wrecks me a little bit. I had just fired her husband, just hours beforehand, and what had to be a day of confusion and uncertainty, for Anne and her family, she took a moment to reach out to me by way of my wife and acknowledge the fact that although the outcome wasn't the best, she really appreciated how I treated her husband throughout the process. And that was pretty amazing. At this point in my career, I had been a leader maybe for about 10 years, and I was leading a couple of hundred people at this point. And if you've ever had the good fortune of leading a couple of hundred people, one of the things that you'll know without doubt is there is literally no limit to the number of uncomfortable conversations that you can have with people. Anybody else have this experience? It's a real thing. In fact, I probably at this point, I had more uncomfortable conversations with people than I could even count. But there was something really different about this time. This time, despite the fact I'd had many uncomfortable conversations with people in the past, this was the first time where I felt like I had walked somebody through a process from beginning to end, and I had actually done a really good job, despite the ending not being great. And it was a really successful experience. And it kind of made me wonder, how is it that I am 10 years into my leadership experience, and arguably I am only now just beginning to master what some people could argue is an absolutely basic leadership skill. Like 10 years seems like a long time. And I started to think about it, and I kind of surprised myself. It didn't take all that long thinking about it. I started to reach a conclusion about, why did it take me, in fact, 10 years to start to master this very basic skill? And here's what I came up with. I think the biggest challenge of leadership is to give what you were never given. And maybe to say that a little bit differently, the biggest challenge of leadership is to model for others what was never modeled for you. And in my experience, the uncomfortable conversations leading up to firing someone are among the least modeled leadership skills. So what I'd love for us to do today is take some time and actually model those skills. So here's my promise to you. If you can stay locked in, give me all your emotional and physical energy for like the next 70 minutes, I'll share the model that arguably I think that we have perfected at Ramsey to overcome the hardest skill in leadership, and that is the process of firing someone with dignity. So when we're done, about an hour from now, you're gonna have the tools to confidently initiate an uncomfortable conversation. You're gonna have a written plan on how to make uncomfortable conversations fair, dignified, and loving. And you're gonna have everything that you need to go back home and teach this to the other leaders that are back home as well. So if that's a promise I can deliver on the next hour, you think that's time well spent? Say yes. All right. Let's do it then. All right. So 4 things that we're gonna kind of go over here together today. First thing is, I want us to talk about why we avoid uncomfortable conversations. Like, what is going on with us internally that causes us to not want to do this hard stuff? Second thing I want to talk about is embracing our role. Like, as the leader or as the owner, what is our actual role during uncomfortable conversations? I'd love for us to actually talk about the Ramsey model for uncomfortable conversations, which is like, how do we think and plan for a successful journey of uncomfortable conversations with a team member? And then lastly, I'd like us to wrap up with the thing that oftentimes people find most valuable about these sessions that we do, which is I'm gonna give you 3 simple plans, written plans. And those 3 written plans are arguably to help guide you through what I consider to be the 3 hardest uncomfortable conversations you'll have as a leader. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. Let's talk about why we avoid uncomfortable conversations. Start with a little bit of question for everybody. Like, how many people in the room here enjoy initiating uncomfortable conversations? How many of you enjoy? The lights are bright. I think I only see a couple. Okay, good news. Almost everyone passed the sociopath test. For the couple of you, we're gonna set up some time for John Deloney in the morning and he'll help you through your stuff. No, actually, I'm kidding. So the couple folks that raised their hands, let's talk about that for a second. It's probably not the case that they enjoy initiating uncomfortable conversations. What has probably happened in their leadership experiences is they might be probably the more evolved leaders among us, which is what they've recognized is that when you are willing to have those uncomfortable conversations, you see growth in the team member, you see a healthier team, and you experience yourself as the leader a much less anxious experience as a leader day to day. So it's not so much that they enjoy initiating them, they've developed a positive association with the outcome of having uncomfortable conversations. And hopefully, everybody's gonna walk out of here with a plan to help you do the same. So what I would actually say is I don't believe that chemically, emotionally, or spiritually healthy leaders enjoy initiating uncomfortable conversations. Like, healthy leaders don't enjoy creating discomfort or pain. In fact, I'd say, I think that one of leaders' biggest fears is abusing their authority. And because uncomfortable conversations feel unpredictable, and they can feel like at any moment they could take a weird turn and hurt someone, it causes us to be very hesitant to initiate them. Uncomfortable conversations feel like a minefield most of the time, like a minefield of opportunity to do harm. So how do we actually overcome the fear of doing harm and actually do uncomfortable conversations the right way? The next idea I'm about to share with you was actually a major unlock in my leadership journey, and that was that hurt and harm are not the same thing. Hurt and harm are not the same thing. As a leader, if you start to become aware of the difference between hurt and harm, initiating uncomfortable conversations becomes way, way easier. Now, some people will say to me, like, oh, hurt and harm, kind of sounds like a distinction without a difference. So if you ask me, like, okay, Brendan, what's the difference between hurt and harm? Well, thank you, I'm gonna tell you. So hurt relates to a person's behavior, and when you poke on someone's behavior, it will create temporary pain in their world. Harm, on the other hand, relates to a person's identity. When you give them feedback that relates to their identity, and when you poke on that, that can actually create lasting damage. So I'm gonna say something here that I can almost guarantee you did not expect somebody on this stage today to say, but it is actually okay to hurt someone if you have their best interests in mind. As a leader, it is actually okay to hurt someone if you have their best interests in mind. It is never okay to intentionally harm someone. So I'd love to share a couple of real-life examples that I have experienced as a leader or observed as a leader on the topics of hurt and harm. But before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of a disclaimer, because this can be a little bit of a touchy thing. So I just want to clarify, I am not trying to be the thought police. In my opinion, we have got way too much of that garbage happening in our world right now. And what I really want to clarify is that in an uncomfortable conversation, what I am interested in, or what I'm not interested in rather, is political correctness. I got no interest in political correctness. What I am interested in during an uncomfortable conversation, in an uncomfortable conversation is getting results. So if it feels like I'm about to be picky with words, here's what it comes down to. If I'm gonna go through the emotional trouble of initiating conflict with somebody, having an uncomfortable conversation, I wanna make sure I get results. And if the words that I'm using during that uncomfortable conversation are standing in the way of me getting the results that I need, I want to change my words. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. So let's walk through a handful of kind of real life examples. So one of the things that I've heard leaders say is you don't have what it takes. I've actually heard people under stress or under pressure say something like this to a team member. The better version, I need you to improve your skills. I've heard leaders say things like, you aren't as smart as I thought. No, not making this stuff up, it's real. It gets worse, by the way. Better version, I need you to focus on critical thinking. I've heard people say you're lazy. I like to say, I need you to share my urgency. No one likes you. It may be true, but you can't say it. You make it difficult to get to know you. And possibly my favorite, you smell like a hobo. No, I've never actually heard a leader say that. But if you do have a team member that struggles a little bit with personal care, the right way to say that is I need you to improve your hygiene, right? But the point is that there is an effective way to communicate with people that are struggling, and there's an ineffective way. If you start to poke at their identity, you're gonna have trouble on your hands. So hurt may hurt, but it's gotta include hope. Hurt may hurt, but it's gotta include hope. You gotta steer clear of what I call the lightning rod of conflict. The lightning rod of conflict. And here's what the lightning rod of conflict is. If you ever explicitly or implicitly, in an uncomfortable conversation, make somebody feel like they won't ever be enough, right then, the relationship's over. What they're gonna do is they're gonna hang out on your payroll for a while hunting for a new gig, and when they find their next job, they're gonna leave you cold. You can never touch that lightning rod of conflict. You've got to make sure that you don't ever explicitly or implicitly communicate to somebody that they'll never be enough. So if you avoid that lightning rod of conflict, it is very unlikely that you will ever actually materially harm someone. So let's talk about getting clear about our role. As leaders, what is our role during an uncomfortable conversation? Like, what do we have to bring to it? So the first thing I'd like to talk about is clarifying the problem. If you don't clearly articulate the problem, you risk the conversation becoming personal. Don't treat people like they're broken. Get crystal clear about the problem and focus on the behavioral issues at hand. My challenge to everybody is you've got to get so clear when it comes to articulating the problem to the team member that your 7th grade English teacher would be proud of you. Second thing, you got to be the coach before the cop. Your most important job as a people leader is to be an advocate for somebody's growth. It is, in fact, possible to simultaneously advocate for someone's growth and address an important issue. You can do both at the same time. It's hard, but we all have to learn to stop making conflict so immensely personal in our heads. You don't actually have to act like law enforcement during an uncomfortable conversation unless, unfortunately, you've gotten to the point where you have to terminate somebody. But there is a long road before first addressing an issue with somebody and getting to a termination. And you got to be a coach and not a cop along the way in that journey. It's really important, really, really important that team members, when you sit down and coach them, understand that it is their job to accept and apply your coaching. You can't be a coach into an echo chamber. You need to clarify for them that when you provide them coaching, it's their responsibility to act. All right. Third thing, our role in uncomfortable conversations as leaders. We need to frame the consequence of inaction. Now, what I mean by this is when you're having an uncomfortable conversation, you got to be pragmatic, not punitive. As leaders, we need to help remind people that sometimes their behavior has natural consequences. What I'm not implying is that it's a wise thing to issue threats. But it is really important that you actually use the opportunity of an uncomfortable conversation to create a massive level of clarity. And the team members got to understand that they have to share your urgency for solving the problem. They got to apply your coaching, and they got to share your urgency. So there's a metaphor that I use to kind of tie those two ideas together. And I want to talk about it real quick now. We'll dive deeper into it toward the end of our time together here. But it's called the table metaphor. And the reason why the table metaphor is important is because it's really easy for an uncomfortable conversation to become unnecessarily adversarial. So let's walk through the table metaphor a bit. So just to make sure that when we talk through this table metaphor, that the example is not, that it doesn't feel abstract or like it doesn't really apply. Let's go ahead and come up with a fictitious team member that's having some problems. We're gonna call him Bob, right? And so I'm gonna kind of simulate here what talking with Bob would sound like if I'm using the table metaphor. So I might say to Bob, listen, I know we're having an uncomfortable conversation, but it's really important that I clarify my role in this uncomfortable conversation with you. Right now, you and this problem that you're having are on one side of the table, and your teammates are on the other side of the table. And if we're not careful here, it is easy to confuse what side of the table I'm on as your leader. And I want to clarify, Bob, that actually I'm on your side of the table. I'm not on the other side of the table. We're collaborators in the attempt to work through some of the issues that we're talking about. My goal is to get you back on the other side of the table with your team. And in order to do that, in order for these coaching sessions that we're going to start walking through to be successful, there's only two things that you got to do. Just two things. You got to share my urgency, and you got to apply my coaching. That's it. When I provide you coaching, you got to put it into effect. And by virtue of me bringing this topic up with you, I need you to match my level of urgency. If you don't, Bob, I hope we do. Just to be clear, I'm here to be your coach. I hope that the conversations that we're having here together are going to be successful. But if you don't, I've got to make it very clear that I'm going to be forced into a decision where I have to potentially get up from the table or go to the other side of the table. And I think we both know what that means, and I think we both can agree that is absolutely the last thing that we ever want to happen. So I really need you to share my urgency and apply my coaching. All right, that is the table metaphor. That's going to come into play a little bit later when we start walking through these three simple plans that I mentioned before. But let's go ahead and talk about real quick the fourth aspect of what our role is as leaders in uncomfortable conversations, and that is drawstringing feedback. Drawstringing feedback. So I mentioned it's easy for uncomfortable conversations to become an unnecessarily adversarial situation. And the setup that causes that to happen is it's you and it's Bob sitting down at a table together, and there's just two people in the room. And it's really easy for a belief to start to develop that it is you against them. And you have got to act as a leader in order to neutralize that relationship dynamic that can start to form. So when I say drawstring feedback, what I mean is you aren't the only person that is experiencing Bob. There are other leaders in your organization, other maybe senior contributors inside your organization whose feedback and input you can trust. One of your most important roles as a leader in an uncomfortable conversation is to drawstring all that feedback and help Bob become more aware of the problem that he is having in a more broad way with the team at large, and not turn it into an adversarial situation between you and Bob if it's at all possible. All right, so I'd love for us to jump in to the model, the Ramsey model for uncomfortable conversations. And the best way that I can kind of explain this is there are a handful of key ingredients in talking through the model that we use to help us prepare for uncomfortable conversations at Ramsey. Now, I would like to tell you that, I hold myself up in my office and had a strategic moment on a whiteboard, and that's how I came up with this model. But the truth is I stumbled on it. I figured this model out by accident. In fact, it wasn't me at all who figured out the model. It was Anne and her text message. Ever since I got that text message, her words got burned into my mind. Fair, dignified, and loving. And when I got that message for her, it really started to clarify the unconscious things that I was doing as I walked her husband through the process of these uncomfortable conversations. And it's actually Anne that really helped us put this model together. So let's start to walk through it together. So the first part is, at Ramsey, we use process to make the conversation fair. Now, I'm like you. I'm a high D on the disc. I imagine most of you are too. And sometimes when things upset you inside your business, it is easy to instantly act. And we use not an overbearing process, but we use a minimum amount of process at Ramsey to kind of help us counteract our gut instincts to basically keep us from firing somebody in an unfair way. The next thing that we use is that we use preparation. Using preparation leading up to an uncomfortable conversation or a series of uncomfortable conversation helps us keep those conversations dignified. If you don't have the core of dignity during uncomfortable conversations, the likelihood that things are going to go well are very, very low. And the third part is using principles to keep the conversation loving. So we're going to jump into each one of these. Let's start with process. So using the process to keep an uncomfortable conversation fair. So there are 5 types of uncomfortable conversations that we use at Ramsey as part of our process. And using all 5 types of those conversations, make sure that we keep things fair for the team member. Let's walk through those real quick. So the first one is what we call first contact. And first contact's pretty simple. It's the process of guiding a team member to help them create some awareness around the issue that we're having. The second that we use is coaching. And coaching is just the process of guiding the team member away from whatever that behavior is. Now, I want to make sure that I communicate that this isn't just 5 meetings with the team member. You could spend some time coaching a person. It's not like you're going to sit down and give somebody a coaching session. They're going to have a complete 180-degree turnaround in 12 hours and you're never going to have the problem again. But if you asked me, hey, Brendan, what's the appropriate number of coaching sessions? And you gave me the choice between 3 and 33, the answer would definitely be 3. We don't want to end up in an endless coaching pattern with our team members, but we do want to give them a fair shot to turn things around. In the event that they can't turn things around, we do a thing at Ramsey that we call the emotional firing, which oftentimes when I talk about this, you can see some people kind of have a reflex to that phrase. It's an intense phrase, and it's an intense phrase on purpose. Because if coaching fails, we don't want to just instantly fire somebody. What we want to do is we want to foster an environment where people understand the true depth of the consequences of their decision making or their lack of action. So if coaching fails, an emotional firing is a last-ditch effort to save the relationship between us and the team member. Now, if they come back into work the next day after the emotional firing, they got some choices to make. And if their choice is, hey, I want to fight for my job, what we will put in front of the team member is a performance plan. And performance plans, we're not going to go through it today, but performance plans are a real point of pain for a lot of companies because they write them and execute them very poorly. And here's what I want you to know about a performance improvement plan. A performance plan is a no wiggle room plan to help somebody save their job. If you learn nothing else about performance plans, it needs to be a no wiggle room plan. And then it makes things very easy to walk through. The last part, and just to be clear, we don't want to bring any celebration or glory to this topic. It's not an exciting thing to do. It's not something that any of us should enjoy doing. But in the event that we actually have to terminate somebody, a termination is just a quick and dignified end to the professional relationship. And what you're about to see is that if you do these first 4 right, a termination is actually very dignified for the team member, and it's actually a pretty fast thing to do. All right, so let's keep on working our way and talk about the principles. So at Ramsey, we use principles to make the conversation loving. And I'd like to go over those principles. So the first, being clear means being specific and honest in getting to the last 10% of truth. So if you're familiar with any Jim Collins work, he talks about this idea of the last 10% of truth. And really all it comes down to is when you're having an uncomfortable conversation with somebody, you need to make sure that anything that you have in your mind that is actually constructive to the conversation moves from your mind and out of your mouth. You do not want to hold any truth back as long as it's constructive. And that is a huge part of creating clarity for the team member. So the opposite of being clear, which honestly is something that I see quite frequently with leaders, is vague feedback. And we'll talk about it here in just a second a little bit more, but I'll be honest with everybody. I think this is a very frequent thing that happens, and I think it either is or is on the border of abusive leadership behavior. So I want to give you an example of this. It's actually pretty close to a real example of something I saw 9 or 10 years ago. And it sounded like this. A leader sat down with a team member. I just happened to be in the room. And the leader said to the team member, well, we'll use Bob as an example. Bob, I've been watching you lately. And I got to be honest, I feel like something's off. I can't put my finger on exactly what the problem is, and I'm not totally sure how to describe it, and I can't give you a specific example of when you've done it, and I'm not sure how to coach you through it. But if you don't fix this, something bad's gonna happen. And you need to fix it right away. I get it, it's funny, and we laugh. But the truth is, in a lot of these uncomfortable conversations, if you walk into them unprepared, you're likely to say some stupid stuff. And I would be shocked if there's anybody in this room that didn't do some version of that at some point in their leadership career. I'm sure that I have. But where I want to challenge you, and this is going to be the only time in our hour together that I'm going to challenge a room of 2,700 people. But if that example comes a little too close to home or sounds familiar, or you think that you have team members back home that would describe you as giving vague feedback, that is a leadership behavior that is either abusive or on the borderline of abusive, and that behavior has got to end today. So if that is something that you're engaged in, that's got to be one of your top priorities of things to work through. It is unfair to your team, and you are maybe unknowingly wrecking the culture inside your company by giving people vague feedback. All right, second principle, focus means limiting feedback and keeping the conversation short. Focus means limiting feedback and keeping the conversation short. So I'll tell you, this is actually the hardest principle for me, because when I encounter a team member that's having a tough time, my nature is to give them all of the coaching and all of the insight and tell them stories about how I made similar decisions and how I've seen other people make similar mistakes. And my nature is to spend a ton of time with them. And the problem with that is the human brain is not designed to metabolize an hour or 2 hours or heck, even 10 minutes of action items on what it is that a person needs to do in order to resolve the unwelcome behavior they've got. We're just not wired for that. So you gotta be really careful not to overwhelm people with too much feedback. You gotta keep it short. Believe it or not, it is actually merciful to be direct, and it is not unkind, and it is not uncaring to be focused and short in an uncomfortable conversation. All right, third principle. Honoring and respecting the team member makes the environment safe and builds rapport. So this word safe, it's a little bit of a loaded term. I talked to John Deloney about it one time, and he said, not only do you need to create safety with the people you work around, you need to create safety with your pets. If you treat a pet like garbage, it's not gonna like you. So you do actually have to foster an environment of safety with your team. But the big caveat is that doesn't mean that you gotta be soft. It doesn't mean that you're putting your tail between your legs and avoiding the truth. Safety has nothing to do with that. In fact, if you do those things, you'll probably remove safety from the situation. So what's the opposite of safety? The opposite of safety is leveraging a person's insecurities to get them to change. And you can't do that. You gotta remember that lightning rod of conflict, which is if you explicitly or implicitly cause someone to feel like they won't ever be enough, the relationship is over. So you've got to create an environment of safety and build rapport, despite the fact that you're having difficult conversations with people. So here's an important call out, and I talk to my team about this all the time. You can't build that kind of, or you can't foster that kind of environment with a team member if you're walking into an uncomfortable conversation already frustrated. What I see characteristically with a lot of leaders is they will wait until their internal boiling point is high enough where they have no other choice but to act and get involved in the situation. And that is inappropriate leadership behavior. What I talk to my team about is that God installed an instrument inside all of our bodies to help us understand when the right time is to have an uncomfortable conversation, and it's called your blood pressure. So my challenge to everybody in the room here today is when you feel like your blood pressure is at a 2 of 10, that is the right moment to start an uncomfortable conversation. If you wait until you're at a 6 or a 7 or an 8 or a 9, there is absolutely no way that you can have a cognitively reasonable, uncomfortable conversation with someone. It will not happen. You will remove safety and you will destroy rapport. So let's talk about how preparation can help maintain dignity during an uncomfortable conversation. So dignity is actually directly tied to preparation. If it is important for you, or if it is important to you to foster an environment of dignity, despite the fact that somebody might be, struggling with their job, the best way to do that is in fact through preparation. So when I talk about dignity, what do I mean? I mean that a dignified, uncomfortable conversation has got to be both challenging and hopeful. It's got to be both. The opposite of that is if you start to notice the team member that you're having a conversation with be, overwhelmed or defeated or flooded or scattered or, emotional in any way, you have a role in that conversation to step in and help them regulate. Now, I want to be clear about something. What I am not suggesting is that it is inappropriate for a team member to get emotional during an uncomfortable conversation. And in fact, in some situations, it can actually be a good sign because it's a signal that they're hearing you. So how do you actually help somebody regulate the right way in an uncomfortable conversation? Well, what I mean by the right way is that sometimes they can start to exhibit emotions in such a way where it is overriding their ability to actually hear the conversation and understand what's going on. So you want to help keep people in their prefrontal cortex while you're having an uncomfortable conversation. If they start to get overwhelmed or scattered in an uncomfortable conversation, it means that their thought process, their consciousness is starting to move back to their amygdala. How they're making decisions is beginning to move into fight or flight. And so to the best that you can, you want to try to help them regulate so they can stay in their prefrontal cortex, they can hear the feedback that you're giving them, and they have a clear and strong understanding of what they have to do next. So the best way to do that, in my experience, is actually very, very simple. So if I'm having a conversation with Bob, one of the things that I'll say to Bob is very simple. Hey, Bob, I realize we're having an uncomfortable conversation, but here's what I know. In 6 months, when you and I look back at this conversation that we're having right now, I know that both of us are going to want to remember it as a dignified experience. And there's something about just giving Bob that simple feedback, reminding him of his own need for dignity that will just cause him to collect himself, get focused, stay in the prefrontal cortex, and stay engaged in the conversation the right way. So one of the concerns that leaders articulate to me a lot of times about the idea of preparedness is I advocate that during an uncomfortable conversation, you actually walk into the conversation with a written plan. I believe that is incredibly important to have a written plan in front of you. And the objection that a lot of leaders have is, hey, if I walk into an uncomfortable conversation with a written plan, isn't it gonna look like I don't know what I'm doing? And the answer is maybe. But you know what's actually worse than looking like you don't know what you're doing? Actually not knowing what you're doing. So walking into an uncomfortable conversation with a written plan is an excellent strategy. And don't worry, a written plan is not actually gonna make you look foolish. Pragmatically, in real life, I have discovered 10 out of 10 times when I walk into an uncomfortable conversation with somebody with a written plan, I sense some level of gratitude from them that I actually spent the time to get prepared, communicate clearly, and give them the information that they need. All right, so this is kind of the moment that we've been waiting for. Let's talk about the simple plans now that we've got all these kind of principles and practices underneath our belt. So I shared with all of you, that we're gonna go through 3 simple plans. We're gonna go through first contact, emotional firing, and termination. If we had more time, we would go through, the other 2. We would go through coaching and the performance plan, but we're just gonna focus on these 3, mostly because I believe these are actually the hardest conversations to have. So if you're somebody that doesn't typically use a handout, I'd encourage you to take out that handout we left on everybody's seats this morning and flip a couple pages back. And what you're gonna see is we're actually gonna provide you templates for a written plan. So let's go ahead and kind of head the direction of a first contact uncomfortable conversation. So a first contact uncomfortable conversation is actually the hardest type of uncomfortable conversation because it's when you actually address that unwelcome behavior with a team member for the first time. So to make sure that we're not walking through these sample conversations or these kind of templates in an abstract way, let's broaden the example of Bob a little bit. I want to give you a case scenario because as I walk you through these written plans, I want you to have a better feeling of how it might play out in real life. So let's talk a little bit more about Bob's circumstances. Let's say that Bob lacks self-awareness around his weakest quality, which is emotional intelligence. Let's say, that Bob actually kind of gets along pretty well with the people that he works with on a day-to-day basis, but the moment he steps outside of his immediate team is where things go sideways. He just doesn't communicate well. He's kind of an accidental mess maker. And let's say that several people that Bob collaborates with from time to time but aren't on his immediate team have come to us, let's just set me up as the leader here, have come to me and shared some concern that they feel like Bob can act politically and oftentimes come off as a bully to the people that he's around. Anybody have a Bob? Has this ever happened? No, I know when I spoke at Summit last year, I made somebody pull out their phone and make a phone call. I'm not gonna do that this time. Yeah, lots of us have Bobs. But the reality of this situation is that both Bob and the team members that Bob's generating some trouble with, both of these groups need our help. So we gotta step in. So the first thing that we gotta do is before we start this uncomfortable conversation, we gotta get really clear on the tone that we wanna use with Bob. The tone that we wanna use with Bob. So, with this situation with Bob, I would say it's probably a mid-grade serious situation. If you had a different situation, maybe with a team member that from time to time will roll their eyes when they're talking to you, I would probably describe that as a more casual, uncomfortable conversation, but it is an uncomfortable conversation nonetheless. And of course, we can all imagine a bunch of scenarios in which we would have to get very confrontational during an uncomfortable conversation. But let's hone in on the situation here with Bob. So when I think about the uncomfortable conversations I'm gonna have with Bob, they're gonna be kind of middle of the road uncomfortable. And you'll see that show up in the template that I walk you through here. All right, so we're gonna simulate a real uncomfortable conversation with Bob. And the first thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna address the tone in the room. And this is incredibly important because you have to remember that when, at least in my circumstance, I work in an office environment. And so if I'm inviting Bob into my office, I might not meet with Bob on a regular basis. Maybe I do, but maybe I don't. And you've got to address the tone of the conversation right off the bat, literally within the first 10 seconds. Because if you don't, Bob's flying from his prefrontal cortex straight back to his amygdala. So when I sit down with Bob, you're gonna see how easy this is. I sit down with Bob. First thing I say to Bob is, Bob, this is gonna be a potentially uncomfortable conversation. Don't worry, no one is losing their job today. Continuing the conversation with Bob, I'm probably gonna say, Bob, as we talk over the next couple minutes, it's important to me that I share a perspective on some of the behavior of yours that I've observed, and I actually want to create a little space in this conversation for you to share your perspective with me. And, if I'm honest, I don't really anticipate this conversation resolving in just one talk. I think we're probably going to have to get together a number of different times to talk about this. So right there, just what we've done so far, we're maybe 30 seconds into the conversation, and you have already created more clarity for Bob in those 30 seconds of that uncomfortable conversation than all other uncomfortable conversations that Bob has ever had cumulatively in his entire life, right? So the next thing that we're gonna do in this first contact uncomfortable conversation is we're gonna talk about the problem with Bob. So Bob, there's some behaviors that I've observed. I want you to hear that this is not a situation of people necessarily complaining about you. I have actually seen this happen myself. We have gotten some feedback from some other team members, but this is behavior that I've seen myself. And I want you to understand kind of the scope of what's going on here. This is not a situation where you're having a problem with a specific person or even your immediate team. The reality is this problem that we're talking about actually impacts the wider team of people around you. And I also want to clarify, this is not something that's just happened once. It's not something that happens once every blue moon. Like, I need you to hear me, Bob, that the problem that we're talking about here actually happens pretty often. And that problem is that you aren't aware that you're treating people on other teams like the enemy, and that you're choosing gossip over healthy conflict. So again, at this point, we're maybe like a minute into the conversation. Bob has massive clarity about what's going on at this point. And I will also say this is a good moment to do a quick dignity check. Like, just scan and see if Bob's doing okay. Providing that he is, we're gonna keep going. We're gonna talk about the impact of Bob's actions. So this part of the conversation, the impact part of the conversation, is gonna take roughly about 10 minutes, and it's because we're gonna get Bob to talk a little bit too. But we're gonna say, Bob, I want you to understand the effect of that problem on the rest of your team. This is not a situation where you're generating a little bit of confusion or maybe people are paranoid. The way that you are behaving with other team members is actually beginning to foster an environment where people don't trust you. And, in terms of the severity or like the urgency on this issue, I need you to hear, this is not a situation where this is like a yield sign or a stop sign or a yellow light. I need you to hear, Bob, that this is a red light. I need you to stop in your tracks. I need you to look around, and I need you to get very aware of the impact that your behavior is having on the people around you. And at this point, I'm gonna do what I call a check for understanding, which is basically getting Bob to talk. And I ask him a couple questions. What are your thoughts? Do you feel like I understand your perspective? The real kicker here is, what will you do to address the problem? And like I said, this is where the majority of our talk is gonna happen. We're gonna move through this. And this is also where we are gonna share the table metaphor that I talked about before, where the real call to actions here are, Bob, I need you to share my urgency and apply my coaching. So toward the end of this part of the conversation, I'm just gonna reiterate with Bob, like, Bob, just to reiterate, I'm still on your side of the table. And I'm gonna fight for you, I'm gonna provide all the coaching I can, and your job is to make sure that you're applying my coaching and sharing my urgency. So the next part I wanna talk about is making sure that Bob is taking the right action, and me as the leader is taking the right action. So I'm gonna say to Bob, Bob, this is one of those situations where I don't feel like it's appropriate for you to navigate this by yourself. This is not yours to fix on your own. And I don't think that the circumstances are right for you and some of the folks that aren't getting along well with you for the two of you or the three of you just to work it out on your own. I feel like this is something that I need to be directly involved with from a coaching perspective as your leader. So I need you to understand, Bob, that this is at a level of urgency where 30 days from now, we need to be able to look back at this situation and see that it's fixed. And because the situation and the timing of all this is urgent, we need to sit down together and have our first coaching session before the end of the week. Like, we need to take some fast action on this. And this is where I'm gonna do something called a safety check. I'm just gonna check in with Bob at the end of the conversation, and I'm gonna say, Bob, listen, you got a lot to think about. When you go home and maybe talk to your spouse about this, or you have some time to process it overnight, if when you drive into work tomorrow, you get a sense that anything about this conversation was one-sided, unfair, or unsafe, I'd love it if you made my office the first stop, because if you feel like I'm in a setup situation here with you, then we're not gonna make forward progress together. Now, as a quick caveat, I will say every once in a while when you have an uncomfortable conversation like this with somebody, they will say to you, you know what? I don't think you've liked me from the beginning. Like, this just feels like a setup. I feel like this whole coaching thing that you're talking about isn't even real, and I ain't gonna do it. Now, that doesn't actually happen very often. It's like 1 out of every 100, but it's happened a couple times to me. And I will tell you, the guide that you have in front of you is incredibly important, because all you have to do is take the guide, turn it over back to the first page, and just jack up the tone. It's easy. Just start the conversation over again. Bob, I don't think you're hearing me, right? All right, so that is actually the conclusion of our first contact conversation. Was that helpful? Say yes. All right, good. You wanna do some more? 2 more? All right, your team is gonna be so freaking excited that you came and had this session today. You go home and tell them, listen, I learned how to rough up your day, All right, so what we're gonna jump into next is the emotional firing. The emotional firing. So an uncomfortable conversation that causes team members, what an emotional firing is an uncomfortable conversation that helps a team member understand that this is a really serious situation that we're confronting, right? It causes the emotions of a termination without the consequences. An emotional firing causes the emotions of a termination without the team member having to experience the consequences of a termination. And just as a reminder, it's kind of that last-ditch effort to save the relationship. All right, so let's jump right in. Let's jump right in to one of these emotional firing conversations. So let's say we had that first contact conversation with Bob. Didn't work out very well. I'm sorry, it did work out well. But then we initiated coaching with Bob. We had, let's say 3-4 coaching conversations. And what we're seeing clear as day is that Bob is not applying our coaching, or he is not sharing our urgency, or he's not doing either of them, right? Which means we can't have endless coaching conversations with Bob. We have to move on to the next step, and the next step is the emotional firing. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna sit down with Bob, and I just need to give him a quick recap on what my perspective is on how these coaching sessions have been going. So I'm gonna say, same thing that I did before. Bob, at the moment he comes and sits down in my office, I'm gonna say, Bob, I need you to understand that the intensity of this conversation is changing a little bit. We're moving from potentially uncomfortable, and honestly, Bob, this is gonna be a very difficult conversation. And I know in past conversations that we've had, I've said that no one's losing their job, but I need you to hear, this is the moment where your job, in fact, could be on the line. And so I just want to help you understand the investment that I've been making, other leaders have been making, you've been making in this coaching process. We have had 5 coaching sessions, and that first coaching session happened about a month ago. And in that first contact conversation we had, I made it very clear that we needed to see substantial progress on the issue that we're dealing with, or actually see it completely resolved within the first 30 days. And we are now at 30 days, and I am not seeing the amount of progress that I'd like to see. So, Bob, one of the things that I've done, I haven't wanted to make this conversation that we're having today, I don't want it to exist in a bubble. And so what I've done is I've gone and talked with some of the other leaders that have some exposure to you on a day-to-day basis, because I don't want to make this conversation unnecessarily adversarial. I've had some observations, but the reality is that some other leaders have had some observations too, and I want to share those observations with you. The first one is when I asked the leaders that you work around most often what your level of participation is in applying my coaching and sharing my urgency, 3 out of the 4 leaders described your participation as defensive. Like you're not really applying the coaching, like you feel like the feedback we're giving you doesn't even wholly apply to you. And when I asked those leaders to give me feedback of where you think the trajectory of the coaching that we've been doing is going, 2 out of the 4 of them told me that they actually feel like the problems that we've been asking you to address are going completely unaddressed. And when I asked those 4 leaders to help me quantify like the level of urgency you're applying to this situation, 3 out of the 4 of them have told me that you're applying no urgency to the situation. And honestly, Bob, I know this is gonna be hard to hear, but when I asked those 4 leaders where your reputation is right now because of how you've interacted with this coaching process that we've gone through, all 4 of them have said that they feel like your reputation is almost unsalvageable. So, Bob, I need to let you know that unfortunately, because you haven't been applying my coaching or sharing my urgency, I am now kind of standing up. I am no longer on your side of the table. Now, I'm also not on the opposite side of the table, but I'm standing because I'm waiting for you to help me make a decision about where we go next in this process. All right, quick pause. How many of you have ever heard a conversation with a team member that is exactly that clear? I would imagine very few. That's why walking into an uncomfortable conversation, particularly a high-stakes uncomfortable conversation like an emotional firing, it is incredibly important you walk in there with a written plan because it will cause you to communicate in such a clear way that you'll get a result one way or the other. Either Bob's gonna opt in or opt out. At this point, we're gonna go through a couple just kind of talking points with Bob, and I'm gonna walk you through this. I'm gonna say, Bob, because I respect you, I'm gonna be direct. It's time for you to make a hard decision. I need you to decide whether you wanna keep trying to save your job or whether you just feel like it's time to move on from our company. If you wanna keep trying, we'll need to do what's called a performance plan. And I gotta tell you, Bob, a performance plan is extremely difficult. What we're gonna do is we're gonna put a sheet of paper in front of you that is gonna clarify in writing exactly the behavior change that we need to see. And I need you to understand, Bob, there is 0 wiggle room in those expectations. Now, Bob, you and I have been working together for a while. We've done 5 coaching sessions together, and I've seen very little progress, and I have to just be honest with you. I have a very low level of confidence that you can turn this thing around. Because if you wanted to turn it around, you would have done it in the first 5 coaching conversations that we had. Now, Bob, that's option 1. If you decide that you want to fight for your job, we're gonna talk tomorrow about a performance plan. But there's a second option. And the second option is, if you make the decision that this is too much, you don't feel like you can make the change, it's just not gonna work out, I'm prepared to provide you some amount of severance if that's something that your company does. It is something that we do at Ramsey in these situations. Honestly, I would recommend it because if there is a sweetening of the pot for Bob just to move on instead of him sitting on your payroll for 30, 60, 90 days, really with no intention of fixing the problem. Frankly, it's money well spent. But Bob, in order to receive severance, you're going to have to fill out some paperwork, right? Now, you probably have to do a dignity check. Check to make sure how Bob's doing. Honestly, if Bob has not responded to 5 coaching sessions, it's not very likely that he's emotionally mature enough to actually have an emotion at this point of the conversation, but sometimes it happens. And you should check for that and just make sure he's doing okay. But I will say, like, Bob, I know this is emotional. Do you understand what's happening right now? You don't want to skip this part, because if Bob is actually having a lot of emotion, a lot of turmoil internally, and you can't pick up on it, he's not going to be able to explain to you what just happened. And if he can't explain to you what is happening, he certainly can't go home tonight, make some important decisions, and come back and talk to you about it tomorrow. So you got to stop and have this conversation, this part of the conversation. Providing that he actually can answer your question, he can tell you explicitly what's happening. It's time to kind of wrap the conversation up and say, hey, Bob, listen, I know this is a lot. I know it's a lot to process. This whole journey that we've been walking through together is a lot to process. I'd actually like you to leave early today from work. Just go home, talk to some friends, talk with your spouse, talk with some trusted advisors. I want you to think about your options. And I'd love first thing tomorrow morning when you get into work to come see me and let's talk. And I'd love to know whether you want to exercise option 1 or option 2. Meeting's over. Bob goes home, right? Now, I'll say real quick before we get to the third plan that if you're anything like Ramsey team members, when they sit through this talk for the first time, you're probably burning a hole through the paper in front of you trying to write everything down. And it's a lot. It's a lot to take in, right? And it's just a shameless little plug. Like, all this stuff's in EntreLeadership Elite. This talk, the forms, you can download them in PDF format, and you can have all the materials you need to have as many uncomfortable conversations as your heart desires. So it's all in there, all the worksheets, all 5, not just the 3 that I'm covering here today. So, all right, let's talk about termination. Now, here's the good news, guys. If you do all of this stuff leading up to this point well, a termination does not need to be the worst conversation ever. Why? Because Bob knows exactly what's going on, and nothing should be catching him by surprise. And honestly, if it does catch him by surprise, there is literally nothing you could have done to not catch him by surprise. So let's talk through a termination. Now, let's make sure that we got the setup right here. Let's say that Bob opts for option 1. He decides he wants to fight for his job. Next day, we meet. We give him a performance plan. We help Bob understand everything on this sheet of paper has to be 100% solved in some period of time. Let's call it 30 days. All of these things need to be addressed. This is a no wiggle room plan. If Bob breaks the rules of engagement on day 3, we're not playing out a 30-day plan just for sport. We're ending it. And Bob should know that. We told him it's a zero wiggle room plan, right? So that is what we're walking into here. Let's say that we gave Bob a performance plan. We're there to support him through it, but he's just not making the turn. He's not making the change. So we unfortunately have to have a termination conversation. So a termination conversation is just a quick, dignified end to the professional relationship. So let's walk through what that actually sounds like. So I kind of have 2 roles that I think are important to have in a termination conversation. The first is what I call the point man. The second is what I call the wingman. It is pretty wise to have 2 different people or another person, a wingman with you in a termination conversation, not just for possibly the legal implications, but because it's actually really helpful to kind of fracture the conversation in half and each of you kind of take a different piece of it. So let's talk through the point man. Let's assume that I'm the point man in this situation. We got to remember, my job is clear, focused, safe, and dignified. Those are the things that I want to make sure happen in this conversation. So let's hit the tone. Bob, this is going to be a potentially emotional discussion. As you know, a performance plan has zero wiggle room on its expectations. And unfortunately, you did not meet those expectations. The decision's been made that today will be your last day. I will tell you that phrase, the decision has been made, might be worth the price of admission to coming to this event. Because in this moment, somebody like Bob may argue with you, and all you have to do is remind him the decision's already been made. Bob, we're gonna offer you blanket severance if you sign a separation agreement. Now, I realize we're kind of getting into some of the tactics of how Ramsey does things. We don't tell Bob at Ramsey that if he blows it, we still might cut him a check. But out of the kindness of our hearts, oftentimes we still will, in fact, do that. So you have to decide as an organization how you're going to handle situations like that. Bob, I know this is emotional. Do you understand what's happening right now? You would be surprised how many people are this far into a termination conversation and they may, in fact, not know what's happening. You have to actually hear them say out loud, I'm being let go, I'm being fired, I'm being terminated, today is my last day. If you don't hear them say that, you need to circle back and help create more of that clarity. Now, at this point, we're gonna start wrapping up our role in this equation as the point man, and we're gonna kind of set up the wingman to take it from here. And I'm gonna introduce the wingman. Let's say the wingman's name is Armando. It's not a joke, our head of HR is actually named Armando, so I didn't just pull that one out of a hat. So Armando's sitting with me in the meeting and I say, hey, Armando's here to answer questions that you've got about what's happening next. I think it's best if I step out of the room so the two of you can discuss those details. And I'll offer a handshake. Sometimes I'll get one, sometimes I won't, but my goal here is to end this thing with dignity, and I'll say something to the effect of, Bob, I'm sorry this didn't work out. I wish you the best in the future. And I'm out of the room. Now, why do I have a wingman in there? Because what will end up happening is Bob will immediately start having questions about, what's the deal about the severance thing, or do I have to sign an agreement, and, what happens to my health insurance, and Bob will have all kinds of questions. Those are really like tactical operation questions that should not be loaded with a ton of emotion. As long as you are in the room, there will be emotion, a lot of it. And it is actually dignified for Bob, for the person who does the termination, to actually step out of the equation and move the conversation on to the more tactical next steps of what's gonna happen. So at this point, the wingman's gonna step in and just let them know what's gonna happen next. And again, you might have your own process for this. This is okay. I'm just telling you how we do things at Ramsey. Armando's gonna tell Bob, HR is gonna call and schedule a time to privately clean out your desk after hours. And we'll also ask Bob in that moment, hey, do you have anything essential at your desk, like car keys or a wallet that we can go get for you and bring back into the room? And the reason why we do that is because we don't want Bob going back into his workspace and be like, I got fired, and start a whole conversation. So we'll send somebody to go get those personal effects for Bob. And then Armando will also let him know that we're gonna set up a time to discuss over the phone stuff like separation agreement, severance, health benefits, and things like that. And we also need to kind of give Bob some context on basically what happens now, between now and 5 minutes from now, when he's about to leave the building. And if you're, if the nature of the employee is that you're letting go, team member that you're letting go, they have access to like privileged information. I will typically say to somebody, like, it's our policy to like immediately limit access to your files, your email, your laptop. It's not personal, it's what we do for everybody. You're welcome to sit here in the room as long as you need to collect your thoughts. I don't want to send somebody out of the building who is, obviously emotional. We let them collect their thoughts. And Armando will just let them know, like, hey, when you're ready, when you feel like you're in a good enough spot to leave the building, I'm gonna go ahead and escort you to the parking lot whenever you're ready. Now, I know I added a lot of color commentary in there, but believe it or not, specifically on the side of the point man, because we've done all this pre-work, an actual termination typically takes 3 minutes or less. It's short and it's dignified, really for the team member's benefit, or the former team member's benefit, right? All right, that was a lot. Everybody okay? All right. Congratulations. Congratulations, you know now how to have like the 3 most uncomfortable conversations that you might ever have as a leader. Go ahead, give yourselves another hand. Good job. So little recap here. Uncomfortable conversations are hard because nobody modeled them for us. But that's no excuse, particularly now that you've gone through this session, because now you have the tools, you have the information you need to step up as a leader and start to master the things that nobody ever modeled for you. So you remember, you gotta understand the difference between hurt and harm. You gotta plainly articulate the problem. You gotta be the coach before the cop. You gotta frame the consequences of inaction. You gotta be clear, focused, create a safe and dignified environment. And you gotta commit to a deep level of preparedness in order to do this process the right way. All right, so how many of you feel more equipped right now than you did 1 hour ago to have the hardest conversations ever? Good, excellent. Yeah, your team's totally gonna be pumped about this. Go ahead, just let them know. I do have to say, Dave asked me to say this on my way out. Please don't hear all this and be like, great, I'm gonna send my problem team member a text message right now and just terminate him. If that is what you took away from this session, you took the wrong stuff away and you need to go watch the video over again. So, all right, well, closing things up. So one of the things that I love so much about the folks in this room, people who are passionate about leadership, is the love that they build for their teams. You and I would not be able to do the job that we do if we didn't actually love some of these crazy people. Like, the reality is we spend more time at work than almost any other place in our lives, and we form meaningful and important relationships with these people over time. And in fact, if you're anything like me, over time, they really do start to feel like family. We do life alongside them. We watch them get married. We watch them start families. We watch them buy their first house. We see them send their kids off to college if you work around them enough. The role that we play in these team members' lives are way more important than just their leaders. And taking the risky emotional steps of being willing to have uncomfortable conversations with people will have an impact on them that is far greater than them just getting better at their jobs. So if you're like me, and maybe as uncomfortable as it is, you might admit that you do in fact love these people, I want to give you a little bit of a challenge. If you love your team, the opposite of love is not hate. It's indifference. Building a truly strong team starts with you telling the truth, even when it's hard. You've got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And if you do, the next time your phone lights up one evening with a notification from someone like Ann, you can be really confident about what it's going to say. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.